Hi, everybody. My name is Dr. Robert Krakehl, and we are going to be looking at a 7-year study of physics in New York State. So why this study? So physics participation provides pre-college students with an academic advantage in terms of post-secondary preparedness for STEM, STEM aspirations, and opportunities to major in STEM disciplines. Despite the relative doubling of pre-college physics course taking, access and participation are still not equitable for all the students in the US. While it's estimated 60 to 70% of all high schools in the US offer physics, this is widely based on contextual factors such as socioeconomic status, locale, and school demographics. Additionally, high poverty schools with large numbers of underrepresented minorities have been less likely to offer physics. And in addition to that, fewer students from disadvantaged socioeconomic backgrounds and students of colors often don't enroll in physics prior to graduation. Physics availability is also widely varied by state within the US, with 4 states offering a physics course in fewer than half of the high schools. Previously, both physics teacher isolation and out-of-field/out-of-subject teaching have been identified as factors related to student achievement in physics, however, often only as a cross-sectional study as opposed to a longitudinal study. So in this, what we want to aim for is 3 main questions over the time span of the 2011-2012 school year to the 2018-2019 school year. Mainly, how has the distribution of physics teachers changed? How has the extent of professional isolation changed? And how has physics availability, course taking, and what physics teachers are actually teaching changed? And this will be among the school contexts of both socioeconomic status and school locale. And so that's some of the variables we'll look at. Additionally, we'll look at the isolation of teachers, and that's going to be defined as the only physics teacher in the school at that time. So that may vary year by year. The course load that a teacher is teaching, and whether they're a full-time physics teacher or not, and that's defined as a teacher who teaches 50% or more physics in their course load. So maybe 2 physics courses and 1 chemistry course, that would be considered full-time. And student enrollment in our pre-college physics course. Okay, that's a standardized course across the state with a standardized ending exam. And so to get this data, the teacher names, where they worked, and what they taught was done through a FOIL through the New York State Education Department. However, all the other information is public, such as enrollment, the number of students who are passing these exams, the teacher certifications, when these certifications were given, what they are designated as, so if it's professional initial, items like that, and the locale designations come from the Common Core of data. And links for all of these are in the references in the latter slides. Okay, so we're going to start with physics teachers. And so the burning question really is, are we growing as a field? Are there more physics teachers? And as it turns out, it appears so, at least across these 7 years. Among the 7 years, the smallest amount was 1,477 teachers, with the largest being 1,608. Okay, approximately 131 more teachers. And as you can see, there is some fluctuation that happens here, and that can be partially explained by schools offering physics 1 year and chemistry the other and alternating back and forth, mostly due to school size. Now, if we break this down by locale and SES, it paints a bigger picture. But before that, it's important to understand how physics teachers are grouped together, where they're only the only physics teacher in the school, if there's 2, if there's 3, if there's 4, or if there's 5 or more physics teachers in the school. So inside of this, the number of isolated and non-isolated teachers has changed. There has been a growth of isolated teachers over the 6 years, at nearly, or 7 years, with nearly 6 teachers a year growing into that isolated category. And so you have a lot of teachers that are going into this field now that are the only teacher in their school. Additionally, there has been a growth of schools with 5 or more physics teachers, with roughly 1 to 2 schools being added to this category a year, which raises the question as to whether programs are growing that are stronger. And additionally, if programs are just growing, but who is actually teaching them? Once again, you can see that these numbers appear to oscillate most likely due to the alternating chemistry and physics offerings in these schools. So how about by locale? What is happening in each of the three locales we look at: urban, suburban, and rural schools? So among the suburban and rural schools, it is pretty consistent in the number of teachers each year, with the fluctuations, of course, for alternating courses. However, within the urban schools, there appears to be a growth that's happening, which is great, right? Urban schools have been identified numerous times as lacking access to physics. So this points out that there may be a growth in the amount of physics being offered, or at least the amount of teachers who are able to help offer it. We can also break this down further to look at the number of isolated teachers by each locale. And when we look at this, there actually appears to be a growth of isolated teachers in urban schools, which is concerning because isolation has been indicated as a predictor of student achievement in the negative light. Okay, so these are teachers who need support, teachers that don't get the support that they may need and don't have the mentorship that they may need. Additionally, suburban and rural schools have a relatively consistent number of isolated teachers. So while their programs aren't growing necessarily, at least the number of isolated teachers is not growing. It's staying consistent, which means that they are not growing their programs necessarily. They're not reducing or increasing number of teachers per school from 1 to 2 or to 3 or 4 or so on. And that may be due to budgetary constraints or due to just enrollment amounts or even student amounts. And now with the urban growth, it's quite interesting because when we looked at the number of novice teachers, so these are just, teachers who are 5 years or newer, who are in the 2012-2013 teacher cohort for that year. So they were teaching that year and we followed their movement. Urban to suburban was the largest amount of movers. Okay, and in this study, it was just accepted, it was roughly 20% of physics teachers were leaving over a 5-year time span, which looking at this data and looking at this previous table, or graph rather, it really indicates that there is growth happening in the urban environment that appears to be greater than just the leaving, okay? So it may be happening faster than turnover, but the retention might not be there. And this may be highlighting that fact. And that's something that we have to look at. And when we look at this by SES, it's relatively stagnant amongst average and better off schools. So better off schools and average schools, there's not a lot of change in the amount of isolated teachers or just regular teachers in this case. However, if we look at the overall growth in the low SES schools, there is a growth in just overall teachers. So there are more teachers being hired in the worse off schools, or at least more teachers teaching physics, okay? If we look at the isolated teachers by SES, so this was just the regular teachers, and you can see that growth. If we look at just the isolated teachers, it's very clear that the worse off schools have many, many more isolated teachers. So these are schools that do not have the funding they may need to run these programs with more than one teacher. They may not have the enrollment or the other supplemental materials such as lab equipment or so on. And the better off schools tend to have the lowest. So they tend to have more than one physics teacher, and that stays consistent throughout this time span. So overall, according to locale, the next important question is how many teachers are actually full-time? So if you think about a new teacher coming out of a grad program, this can really help us to define where to help place them so these teachers are getting access to other physics teachers who are full-time physics. All they teach is physics, or vice versa. Maybe this is a student who is multiple certified that really needs experience with more than just physics, and we can place them somewhere. So suburban schools tended to have the most or the largest percentage of their physics teachers taught 50% or more of their course load in physics. Urban schools was also up there with over 70% of their teachers on average teaching only physics or majority physics, whereas rural schools tended to be lower than that 50% mark. So the majority of teachers in rural schools are actually teaching out of subject. Okay, they may be teaching a physics course, but I don't know if I would identify them as a physics teacher overall due to this nature. Okay. Additionally, if we look at this by SES, the better off schools, well, overall, all physics teachers tend to be above that 50% mark. And that's mainly due to a lot of teachers being in the suburban schools, which has a huge amount of the overall population of physics teachers. So if you become a physics teacher, this tells you will tend to teach mostly physics, at least if you look at it by socioeconomic status. So where you're going to school, whether it's better off or a worse off school, odds are you will be doing physics teaching. Depending on the locale, that will tell you a little bit more about what you might be teaching or the odds that you will be teaching only physics. So at least in terms of SES, if you're in a better off school, there's a much more likely chance that you're going to be teaching a course load that is mainly physics. As you tend towards worse off schools, you start to bring in other courses you might have to teach that you can see by only about 65% of the teachers being full-time physics teachers that are teaching physics. So another question that often comes up is looking at the teacher credentials by these two locales, or by these three locales. At least for this study, we're going to look at 2 years, okay, 2011 to 2012, and then 2016 to 2017, because that data was most readily available. In 2011-2012, 82% of physics teachers held a certification in physics, which is fantastic, right? Highly qualified at that point. They have taken the courses required and passed the tests required and hold that certification, okay, either initial or professional or something to that effect. In 2016 to 17, we can see that there's a decrease to 77%, though there was an increase in the amount of physics teachers by about 200. You can also see that urban schools have a fairly large drop-off of about 8%, going from about 66% certified to about 58% certified, whereas both suburban and rural schools saw an increase in the number of certified physics teachers. Now, the physics availability is also a large question. How many schools are offering physics? So if we look at by socioeconomic status, there are a lot of schools that are worse off that are offering physics. However, those schools also tend to only have one physics teacher, where the better off schools have a lower amount of schools that are offering it. There's also a lower amount of better off schools. However, they tend to have more than one physics teacher. And so it's important to be careful when reading graphs like this, to just have an understanding of why these levels might be there and to think about that teacher density and the isolated teacher density. Overall, it appears that there's a growth in the worse off schools that are offering physics, so lower SES, about 5 schools a year, which means that the access in these lower socioeconomic status areas is increasing, which is important. A lot of research has called for that, but additionally, it's important that we as a community go and we actually look at what's happening there and if these students are achieving, okay? What quality of physics is being taught, especially with isolated teachers and especially with these large percentages of teachers who are not teaching only physics. Okay, if we look at locale, rural schools tended to be fairly consistent along with suburban schools. So these schools may have programs that are consistent, they have the enrollment there. But there's also a growth in urban schools of about 8 schools per year. So once again, we're seeing an increase in access, which a lot of research has called for. Now, in terms of enrollment, because of time, we're going to look at only the college preparatory physics in New York. There's a lot of there's IB physics and AP physics that have to be looked at in the future. But in terms of the college preparatory physics or Regents physics in New York State, it is fairly consistent in enrollment with a decrease in white students and an increase in minorities that seem to be tending towards each other. And we're looking at the percentage of makeup. So white students are accounting for the largest percentage of students tested in this course. whereas the other Asian students, Black or African American or Hispanic or Latino, tend to be lower. However, these charts can be very deceiving, and it's important to look at the distribution of these ethnicities and races over all of New York State schools as compared to just this course. And it turns out that the distribution doesn't fit. There are overrepresentations and underrepresentations. So white students tend to be about 1.5 times higher than expected. Asian or Native Hawaiian students tend to be twice as expected. So they're much more frequent than one would expect. Black or African Americans tend to be there about 1/3 as much as expected, and Hispanic or Latino students tend to be there about 1/3, 1/2 to 1/3 as much. And so there is underrepresentation that's happening that research has called for before, but we can now see a longitudinal trend that there is some uptick, but it is staying relatively stagnant. So there are a couple key takeaways. First, more urban and lower SES schools are offering physics, which is great, but we do need to keep in mind how can we assess the achievement and actually quality of these programs that are increasing, and how can we best support these teachers? Because there is an increase in urban and worse off schools. And so programs may want to help to prepare their future teachers, their pre-service teachers for the schools, with so much research saying that the urban and worse off schools tend to have these achievement gaps that would be amazing to rectify. Growth rates in urban schools may be higher than the turnover rates, which suggests there may be an influx of novice teachers. And so these mentorship programs may be really important, but something we have to look at. Suburban and rural schools' growth appear to be stagnant, which suggests there may be stronger teacher retention and consistent enrollment in physics. Stagnation or consistency is not a bad thing, especially if they're doing well. And there is an increase in the number of isolated teachers, specifically in urban and average SES schools, which really need to be looked at because they will need support, as shown previously in research. And so for future research, similar studies can be done throughout the US. Identifying the certification patterns can also be done, which is important. Identifying growth, stagnation, or decline of the AP physics programs, both in this state and other states, is important. And longitudinal data for student ethnicity and race for enrollment and achievement should also be looked at, and more so other subjects, right? Other courses feed into the physics courses, so it's important to know what's happening in those courses. So here are references that I can share and data sources I can share, and you can reach me here at rkrakehl@gmail.com, so my first initial, my last name, and I would be happy to talk. Thank you.